Hi everybody, and welcome to the Romance of Redemption Part 6. If the end of the journey were certain, faith would not be required. But in the face of uncertainty, fear often challenges our faith. What's the connection between waiting on or resting in God and overcoming fear in the journey of faith? And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized, and he said, No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, How did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her, and added, He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then Naomi said, Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. He told her not to be afraid. At the feet of our Redeemer, we have nothing to fear. In verse 1, Naomi had expressed confidence in Boaz's character when she risked harm to Ruth in the advice that she'd given her. And here we see that her confidence in Boaz's character was not misplaced. The word that Boaz used here was exactly the same word as is used in Proverbs 31 and verse 10. In fact, Ruth is the only woman in the Bible for whom this word is used. Notice it also says that everybody in town knew that she was a woman of virtue. That would have included the nearer kinsman redeemer. Boaz acts righteously, choosing not to exercise his right as kinsman redeemer unless the closer kinsman redeemer relinquished his rights. Even in the middle of the night, Boaz did not hesitate to do his duty towards Ruth. He made his own personal desires subordinate to the traditional custom, and only when this permitted him to marry Ruth was he ready to do so. He says, lie here. Now we missed something in the translation. There are actually 2 words that could have been used in the Hebrew. One has sexual connotations and the other doesn't. In the Hebrew, it's clear that there isn't anything sexual going on here. The verb used removes all ambiguity about the implications of sexual relations between the two. They were both in a very tempting situation, but integrity rather than passion ruled the night. If he wants to do his duty, and then it says in verse 14, no one must know that a woman came. We have the benefit of hindsight. We know how the story ends, but Boaz at this point didn't. He didn't know whether Ruth would become his wife or the wife of the other man. And he was careful to protect her reputation so that nothing would hinder her marriage to that other man if he chose to claim her as his wife. Not only didn't they do anything wrong, but Boaz even insisted on no appearance of wrongdoing. Notice it says she lay at his feet until the morning. I don't imagine that they would have slept much after that. They probably chatted through the night. Boaz probably lay there strategizing what he was going to do, how he was going to meet his commitment. Ruth probably thought about what it might be like to be married to the other man, all the while hoping that she would marry Boaz. Verse 15, 6 measures of barley. And then verse 17, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Remember in chapter 1, verse 21, Naomi was empty, but here she is being filled by her kinsman redeemer. As I said, they probably talked into the early morning hours. Ruth probably told Boaz that it was Naomi who had encouraged her to come and do this. And in a very real sense, what he was doing here was thanking Naomi with this gift, because she had effectively given her permission or her blessing on him marrying Ruth. And obviously he appreciated that. In verse 16, she asks, "How did it go, my daughter?" And then Ruth told her everything Boaz had done. Now, the Hebrew actually literally says, "Who are you?" We could imagine there'd be a pause after this question. Effectively, it was like Naomi was saying, are you still Ruth the Moabite, or are you now the prospective Mrs. Boaz? And notice this was the second time in a matter of hours where Ruth was asked, "Who are you?" First by Boaz, and here by Naomi. Had Boaz been inappropriate with Ruth during the night? Well, we're told here that she held nothing back. She told Naomi everything. If Boaz had been inappropriate sexually with Ruth, surely she would have said that to Naomi. And when we look at how Naomi responded to Ruth, we see that there was nothing in her response that denigrated Boaz, as surely there would have been if he'd been inappropriate with Ruth during the night. From verse 17 onwards, Ruth has a passive role. We saw that she approached Boaz and claimed the right of the widow with the kinsman redeemer. And as we've seen earlier, that was how the law played out. But interestingly here, from this point on, Boaz, not Ruth, does all the work, including confronting the nearer kinsman redeemer. And that's really how redemption is with us. Jesus did everything. We did nothing to contribute to the work of redemption. Wait, my daughter. Ruth and Naomi had to wait. Naomi's advice to wait clearly indicates that she was taking a stance of faith. She expressed it as a command to Ruth. Effectively, it was like a mother attempting to instill confidence in her daughter that God could be trusted to take care of this. The events of chapter 1 have been reversed. Through Ruth, Naomi now has confidence in God. Both she and Ruth have to wait on God to work through Boaz. Try putting yourself in Ruth's situation, the sense of anticipation. Ruth, as we saw in chapter 2, was a doer, someone who took the initiative and acted. Now she had to trust God and wait. So too Naomi and Boaz. He had a plan and was promptly acting on it, but he had no guarantee that it would work out the way that he hoped. That's the journey of faith. Faith is about who we place that faith in, that is, in God, not the outcome. All three had entrusted themselves into God's care. No matter the outcome, Ruth trusted God and was confident that he would do the best for her in this situation. For Ruth and Naomi, the waiting involved doing nothing. But for Boaz, it involved action, showing that waiting on God doesn't necessarily mean inaction. Boaz was acting out of love, not to earn love. Remember in 2 Corinthians 5, it says, "The love of Christ compels us." We saw it earlier with Ruth in chapter 2, when she worked all day and into the night. Why? Because she loved Naomi. She wasn't doing it to earn Naomi's love. She was doing it because her love for Naomi compelled her to do this work. Our Redeemer did not hold anything back because he loved us. For the joy set before him, celebrating the marriage feast, he endured the cross. We enter the rest of marriage because the work of redemption is finished. He did everything. Even our faith doesn't save us. Faith is the means, but it's our Redeemer's blood that saves us. Faith enables us to lay hold of the salvation which he purchased for us. Returning to Naomi's 3 challenges, it's now certain that Naomi's land would be redeemed, either by Boaz or the other man. It's also certain that Ruth would be protected through marriage, either marriage to the other man or to Boaz. But what's not certain is whether Naomi's line would continue, because regardless of whom Ruth married, remember she had been married to Mahlon for 10 years and hadn't had any children, so maybe she just couldn't have children. Meanwhile, Boaz went to the town gate and sat down there, just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along. Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." "I will redeem it," he said. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." At this, the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself, I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to another. This was the method of legalising transactions in Israel. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," and he removed his sandal. Notice they went up to the town gate. Now we've got a picture here for you of a city gate. The city gate was where the city's business was conducted and where justice was administered. In those days, a town was surrounded by walls to keep the enemy out. Remember, this is early in the period of the Judges, where Israel had gone in and conquered the land, and for a long time still they had conflict with the surrounding nations. So you can see by this picture here how solid the wall was, and a solid rock wall, and the protection that was here, and it was high up so that they could see the approaching enemy. And it was inside this gate, or a gate like this, that the city business was conducted. Boaz went to the city gate to wait for the nearer kinsman redeemer, because he knew the man would come through this gate. Remember, Ruth just happened to glean where? In Boaz's field. To her, she was just going into a field, but God directed her to go into a very specific field, and it was one belonging to Boaz. Here, Boaz had planned to be where he was sure his nearer kinsman redeemer would go past. And when did he get there? Just as the other man came. We plan, but God directs our steps. The nearer kinsman redeemer is not named. As we see in verse 7, with the removal of the sandal, there was actually shame associated with not meeting your obligations as a kinsman redeemer. And not only were you shamed, but your descendants were shamed as well, as we see in Deuteronomy 25. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. So presumably he's not named here so that neither he nor his family would bear that shame. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town. It's through this public witness of the transaction that Boaz ensured that the requirements of the law were met. The fact that these men promptly obeyed Boaz is an indication of the power and influence he had in this city. Now I want you to look at his strategy here. We read these next couple of sentences as though it's just like, one conversation. What we're missing is the intonation, the expression, the facial cues that go into all of this. And so I just want you to imagine this, because he's been strategizing about how to achieve his purpose. He said Naomi, who has come back from Moab. He didn't just say Naomi. Very deliberately, he's mentioned here that she's come back from Moab. Why? Because he's planting a thought, a hook that he wants to come back to in verse 6. 4 chapters of the book of Numbers are devoted to the hatred that the Israelites had for the Moabites. As we saw in an earlier session, to the 10th generation, descendants of Moabites were not allowed into the assembly of God. And in Deuteronomy 23, even friendship with Moabites was condemned. So when he says here that Naomi came back from Moab, you could imagine like a shiver going down the spines of the people in the audience, or like a collective type reaction in the audience. And Boaz is very skillfully here proceeding with the negotiation. The law stipulated that every 50 years, in what was called the Year of Jubilee, ancestral land was returned to the family owners. In between that time, the land could be leased out. And the longer the period before the next Year of Jubilee, the more valuable the lease, because the person who was taking out the lease would have more productive years in which to use that land. Since Elimelech had no heirs, and we know Naomi was too old to have children, this would have been very attractive to the kinsman redeemer. Why? Because when that 50 years comes round, the Year of Jubilee, Naomi wouldn't have any children to pass it on to. So if he redeemed the land, it would actually stay with him and his family for all of their generations. So by redeeming this land for Naomi, he was really redeeming it for his own children to have in perpetuity. And his only obligation would be, A, to pay the fee for the land, but 2, that he would have to care for Naomi. She'd become one of his wives and he'd have to care for her. So very low cost and a huge benefit to him and his descendants. Obviously, that would make redeeming the land very attractive. Notice too it says, our relative Elimelech, and in chapter 4 verse 17, the women say, Naomi has a son. So this suggests that Elimelech and Boaz and this other unnamed kinsman redeemer were either brothers or cousins. In verse 4, in the presence of the elders of my people, and then the man says, I will redeem it. So there were other people present, not just the 10 that Boaz had brought together. And remember, this was in a time there was no TV, no social media. The gathering of the council at the city gate would have been something that would have attracted lots of people as onlookers. And it's quite possible that Naomi and Ruth were also in that wider audience. So when this man said, I will redeem it, you can imagine Boaz's heart sinking a bit here, like, oh no, he's going to redeem it. And if Ruth and Naomi were in the audience, their reaction as well, disappointment. What's really interesting here is in our journey of faith, that example that we have of Jesus in the boat and the storm comes and, there's an obstacle in the way. Or sometimes we see as obstacles of our faith are like sin or something goes wrong. But it's not always the case. Here we have an example of righteousness as an obstacle in the path of our faith. Boaz rightly gave this man the opportunity to do his duty. And here, this man rightly decides to do his duty. So here, this journey of faith is being frustrated by good men doing the right thing. It's not hard to see that Boaz was handling the situation masterfully. He had no doubt anticipated this answer from the other kinsman redeemer. And the next thing he brings up is the Leverite marriage principle. So I've just got one here to remind you from Genesis 38. Then Judah said to Onan, "Sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother." In verse 5, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you acquire Ruth." Notice, the Moabite. He doesn't, just as earlier, he hadn't just said Naomi, he deliberately said Naomi, who has returned from where? Moab. And here he doesn't just say, oh, you're going to get Ruth, but Ruth the Moabitess. He's emphasizing that point. We can see here he is being strategic. Probably over the last 3 months before this point, he had been daydreaming about, oh, wouldn't it be great to marry Ruth? I wonder how that could come to be. And then this night where she's come to him, he's lain awake there strategizing about how he's going to achieve his purpose. Now that it's almost within his reach, he's determined to do everything he can to make certain that he will marry Ruth, not the other man. So we read this and we miss all the expression that's there. But remember his purpose. Does he want to sell the idea of redemption to the other man? No. Quite the opposite. He wanted to present the situation in a way that would make it likely that the other man would decline. So we read this as a single sentence, but possibly he would have paused before he said, the Moabite. He would have emphasized that. In chapter 3 and verse 11, we're told all knew that she was a woman of great virtue. But notice that Boaz doesn't remind the other man of this. He doesn't say, oh, everybody in town admires her. She's a hard worker, she's selfless, she's dedicated, she's loyal, she's caring, she's polite. He doesn't say any of that. Why not? What's his purpose? If he was wanting to sell this other guy on, you should marry Ruth, he would have said all of those things. But he doesn't mention any of that. Instead, he mentions the one thing that's likely to really put this guy off. She's a Moabitess. Remember, the kinsman redeemer had to be willing to assume all the obligations that went with redemption. It was all or nothing. There was no in between. Boaz had started with the most desirable part of the obligation, the redemption of the land. But then he proceeded to make the deal less and less attractive. First of all, it meant losing the land. Remember, it was really attractive for the man to redeem the land because it would stay with his descendants forever because Naomi was too old to have children. But now, if Ruth was part of the bargain, it meant that he risked losing that land because if he had a son with Ruth, then that land would become the inheritance of that son. And regardless of whether she bore a son or not, this man would now be burdened not only with Naomi, but also with Ruth and any other children that they had. You know, if she had all girls, he would have to look after all of them. By the law of redemption, Ruth and Naomi came with the land. So, as I've said here, Boaz probably emphasized the fact that she was a Moabite. Ruth was the wrong race, a Moabitess. It was against the law to marry foreigners from certain nations. The Moabites aren't specifically mentioned, but we're told, as we've seen in earlier sessions, sexual relations with the Moabites was condemned. So clearly the implication is you're not to marry them as well. Verse 6, then I cannot redeem it because it might endanger my own estate. The increased financial burden inherent with rearing another family was clearly a contributing factor to his decision, together with the probability of losing the property if a son were born to Ruth. But the stigma of marriage to a foreigner, especially a Moabitess, was the main reason for his refusal. He was unwilling to have his family inheritance split between his existing children and any potential offspring from Ruth. Now, I really want you to think about this next point. This is critical. The nearer kinsman redeemer gave up his right, fearing it would negatively impact upon the inheritance to his offspring. So often in our journey of faith, fear challenges our faith. Not only do we not know the name of the man, but his family line and inheritance are buried in oblivion and disgrace. They are the family of the unsandaled. Whereas Boaz's family line was honoured above all the families of Israel. This could have been, this could have been the outcome for that nearer kinsman redeemer. Fear robbed him and his descendants of this honour. Boaz here is like the heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11, many of whom died before ever seeing the outcome. Boaz, his faith, was rewarded in the generations which followed, the Davidic line of kings and eventually Jesus. But like the heroes in Hebrews 11, he died before seeing any of that. Verse 6, redeem it for yourself. The outcome Boaz had worked hard to achieve had been achieved. Verses 7 and 8 about the redemption and the need to use the sandal. So I've got a quote here from Deuteronomy 25. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, her husband's brother shall take her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother. However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and take off one of his sandals. This giving up of his right as the nearer kinsman redeemer to Boaz by taking off his sandal and giving it to Boaz in front of witnesses symbolised that he was giving up his right to walk on Naomi's land. We see an example of this with Abraham in Genesis 13 and Joshua in Joshua 1 verse 3. Also, just like last session, we looked at the hem of the garment, and clearly there, Boaz was symbolic of Jesus. So here again, we see that with the removal of the sandal. In Exodus 3, Moses removed his sandals in the presence of God when he was on holy ground. And Joshua removed his sandals before God on holy ground, as we see in Joshua 5. By law, the nearer kinsman redeemer should have done his duty. But the law cannot redeem us. Instead, it highlights our need of redemption. What the law could not do, that is, marry a Moabite, grace could. The nearer relative was not willing to meet all of the obligations, but Boaz was. If God can redeem Ruth, a Moabitess, he can redeem anyone, including you and me. To redeem during the period of the judges had three meanings: to free from bondage, from poverty, and from death. Our Redeemer freed us from bondage, poverty, and death. Thank you.